Chapter 11. Few beginning teachers are concerned about issues related to school governance and finance. The topic seems remote to them. It is something administrators and representatives of teacher organizations care about, but it does not seem particularly vital for beginning teachers who are more concerned with learning how to survive in the classroom. We feel differently. We believe beginning teachers must have some understanding of the ways schools and school systems operate because they will be affected personally by governance and finance decisions. Not understanding how these decisions are made and how they might affect you as a teacher will reduce your effectiveness as a professional. How would you explain the following decision? A very popular high school teacher was not given tenure. The sex education program being planned in your local school district was never implemented. A textbook with a fresh approach to the curriculum was removed from curriculation after a year, even though the teachers favored its use. A coalition of superintendents from 4 school districts in your state sued the state government for increased financial support. It is quite possible that at least one of these decisions has been made in your local school district or state. All of them reflect the ongoing struggle of governance, control, and influence over the public schools. This chapter explores how the U.S. educational system is organized, governed, and financed. Although there are legal authorities for the schools and organizations established to exercise this authority, the educational system is strongly influenced by interest groups that do not appear on any organizational chart. First, we examine the legal governing authority that exists in most states, and then discuss special interest groups that influence educational policy. Next, we look at how the U.S. educational system is financed and explore how disparities between rich and poor school districts are generating strong challenges to current financing policies. Finally, we examine the increased role of the federal government in education, particularly through the No Child Left Behind legislation and the economic stimulus money sent to the states. In most countries, the public schools are a branch of the central government, being federally financed and administered and highly uniform in curricula and procedures. In the United States, however, responsibility for the public schools evolved as a state function as a result of the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which reserves all powers to the states and the people that are not specifically designated to the federal government. Each of the 50 states has legal responsibility for the operation and administration of the public schools within its own boundaries. In most aspects of public education, the authority of federal, county, and city educational agencies is subject to the will of the state authorities. Although legal responsibility for school governance belongs to the states, policy decisions and administrative have traditionally been delegated to local school boards. These school boards exist largely because Americans have come to insist on control of schools at the local level. Recently, however, states have been reasserting their policy-making prerogatives. Policy analysts agree that the state legislators are the most influential actors in establishing educational policy. Legislators wield such power because they make the laws that govern and affect education within their states, and they appropriate the money needed to fund state government. In recent years, because of the high profile of educational issues, legislators' interest in education policy has increased, particularly in the areas of school finance and the establishment of standards for student academic achievement. Like legislators, the government's office has the power to affect educational policy, but often chooses to do so only on limited issues. Many governors, however, have played more prominent roles, beginning with the educational reform of the 1980s. Former President Bill Clinton and his Education Secretary Richard Riley, for example, became nationally visible as governors through their educational leadership in Arkansas and South Carolina, respectively. Former President George W. Bush likewise successfully promoted his education agenda as governor of Texas. On financial issues, the roles of governor and legislator are especially obvious. Governors produce and legislators act on budgets that contain funding for school districts. This is, as one wag has stated, the golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rules. When state economies are strong, more tax revenues are available to invest in public education. Conversely, when recession occurs and state governments face a loss of tax revenues, they cut back on their educational commitments and initiatives, forcing school districts to make corresponding cuts in their budgets. In either scenario, governors and state legislators have tremendous influence over educational policymakers and expenditures. The state's legal responsibility for public education requires it to establish an organizational framework within which the local school districts can function. The result is the establishment of a state board of education, to exercise general control and supervision of schools within the state. The State Board of Education is the state's educational policy-making body for elementary and secondary schools. It typically sets goals and priorities for education in the state, formulates education policy and curricular offerings, including establishing academic standards and their assessment, establishes and enforces rules and regulations for the operation of educational programs, represents the public in matters regarding the governance of education, reports to the public on accomplishments and needs, and makes recommendations to the governor and or state legislator for the improvement of education. The State Board of Education also establishes and enforces minimum standards for the operation of all phases of elementary and secondary education, from the state to the local school system level. The procedure for selecting state board members varies from state to state. In most states, members are appointed by the governor. In about 1/3 of the states, however, members are elected by popular vote. The number of members on a State Board of Education varies from state to state, but a board of 9 to 15 members is typical. The executive officer of the State Board of Education, the chief state school officer, usually is responsible for the administration of public education and reports to the State Board of Education. The responsibilities normally involve serving as the chief administrator of the State Department of Education and the State Board of Education, recommending improvements in educational legislation, arranging studies, and creating task forces to identify problems and propose solutions, and reporting on the status of education within the state to the governor, legislator, State Board of Education, and the public. This officer exercises little direct administrative authority over local educational officials, but his or her indirect influence is widely felt at the local level. The officer is elected by voters in 14 states, appointed by the governor in 12 states, and appointed by the State Board of Education in the remaining 24 states. The State Department of Education usually operates under the direction of the State Board of Education and is administered by the chief state school officer. The State Department of Education is responsible for carrying out the policies of the State Board of Education and the laws passed by state legislature. It consists of a large bureaucracy of officials, often numbering in the hundreds of employees. Originally organized to provide statistical reports, state departments of education have grown in size, power, and influence over the years. Their primary responsibilities usually include administering and distributing state and federal funds, licensing teachers and other educational personnel, providing schools with technical assistance in improving curriculum and teaching, providing educational data and analysis, providing administration for special programs, accrediting college and university educational license programs, evaluating existing programs, and issuing reports. Most school districts and colleges of education are strongly affected by the policies and actions of these state departments. School and college personnel, including public school teachers, serve on an advisory committee and task forces to assist the chief state school officer and the State Department of Education in their decision-making processes. To facilitate local control of education, the state creates local school districts for the purpose of carrying out education in a manner that conforms to state policy. Thus, the school district is a unit of the state government and is usually distinct from the local municipal government. The policy-making body of the school district is the local school board, which represents the citizens of the school districts in setting up a school program, hiring personnel to operate the schools, determining organizational and administrative policy, and evaluating the results of the program and the performance of personnel. Many school boards are empowered to raise money through taxes. Although school board members are usually elected by the citizens of the local district, they are officially state officers, and they must follow the guidelines and policies established by the legislature, the State Board of Education, and the State Department of Education. The tension between states' efforts to regulate educational policy and local districts' desire to determine their own policies has increased in recent years as states have taken the initiative in the educational reform movement. Methods of selecting school board members are usually prescribed by state law. Approximately 96% of all U.S. school boards are elected by popular vote, and the rest are appointed, often by the local mayor or city council. What does the composite profile of school board members look like? The majority of today's school board members are male, white, and between ages 40 and 59. Demographic characteristics have changed little in recent years. The proportion of women serving on school boards has increased from 12 to around 44% since 1972, but representation of minorities remains small. 81% of school board members are white. At least 86% of all school board members have annual family incomes exceeding $50,000. 3/4 of them have at least bachelor's degrees. Most are professionals, managers, or business owners, have children, in public schools and consider themselves to be either moderates or conservatives. Thus, in many ways, school board members are not typical of the public they serve. Whether or how this difference influences their values and decisions is not known. Can you think of any ways in which it might? The superintendent of schools is typically a professional educator selected by the local school board to act as its executive officer and as the educational leader and administrator of the school district. In a few large urban areas, such as Chicago and Washington, D.C., the mayor of the city schools chooses the superintendent, giving the mayor more power and accountability over the schools. The superintendent is undeniably the most powerful officer in the local school organization, given that the school board consists of lay people who are usually not education experts. It often delegates many of its responsibilities to the superintendent and his or her staff. One of the superintendent's most important functions is gathering and providing information to the local school board so its members can make informed decisions. Additionally, the superintendent must recruit, select, place, and promote personnel. Often the superintendent plans the budget and supervises the maintenance, construction, and renovation of school buildings. Decisions about how to improve educational opportunities, including all aspects of curriculum and instruction, may originate with the superintendent. The superintendent generally has responsibility for maintaining harmonious relations with the community by communicating the mission of the school to the public and marshaling support for district programs. Theoretically, the superintendent's role is administrative and executive. He or she keeps the school functioning, whereas the local school board of education retains policy-making responsibilities. In practice, the superintendent has become the major policymaker in the school district. The way a school board and superintendent operate together to govern a school district depends on their relationship. According to independent observers, this relationship is often categorized by conflict. One observer, Larry Cuban, asserts that conflict is and always has been the essence of the superintendency. One measure of conflict between superintendents and school boards is the turnover rate. That is, how often superintendents change their jobs. The average tenure for superintendents in urban districts is slightly less than 5 years, and the national average among all superintendents is 5.5 years. Cuban describes the conflict between the superintendent and the school board, or between the superintendent and local private groups, as one of seeming competitors seeking to achieve their goal at the expense of the other participants. Cuban maintains that the issues over which school board administrators disagree may change as a result of shifting political concerns, changes in school funding or demography, or constantly changing coalitions of teacher or local continuities. Whether the particular issues, however, the relationship often remains tempestuous. Although school boards hire and fire them, superintendents are expected to lead the board. If they fail to do so, board members are likely to act independently, often with disastrous consequences. School boards and superintendents search constantly for local continuities to provide the funding and support for school programs. And with every school board election, new points of view may be brought to the governance of the district. Superintendents must weather these changes in point of view and the emerging coalition resulting from board member turnover. Sympathies with the school's mission may be in a constant state of flux, requiring superintendents to exercise coalition building skills. Their survival as non-elected public officials rests on their ability to mobilize support and manage conflict. For the schools within a school district, the superintendent and the local school board of education select professional educators to serve as principals. High schools and middle schools may have a staff of administrators to assist the principal, including assistant or vice principals, with specific responsibilities for discipline or curriculum and instruction. At the elementary level, principals may be responsible for more than one school building or may serve part-time as teachers. Whatever the pattern of administrative assignments, those who act as principals are generally considered to be part of the administrative organization, directly accountable to the superintendents and the local school board. As administrators, principals usually interview prospective teachers and make teaching assignments, supervise and evaluate staff members, schedule students and classes, manage school budgets, administer district discipline policies, and proctor and dispense supplies. Their tasks are many. To list them all would be impossible. Historically, the role of the principal has included management, supervision, and inspection duties. Most importantly, principals are expected to function as instructional leaders for their schools. In a number of states, principals and their teachers are being held accountable for increasing student learning on statewide assessments of achievement. However, As can be seen in the Voices from the Classroom feature, principals and teachers may not always be on the same page. Effective principals serve as instructional leaders by promoting a productive working and learning environment. They do so by understanding the mission of the school, communicating it to the staff and students, and rewarding excellent performance. They also represent to the school, to parents in the community, involving parents and community members in the school's activities and securing their support for these activities are important functions of the principal. Remember the cartoon where the school of fish swims along sporting motorboards? Well, I can carry the metaphor even further. Teaching with the support of the principal and local administration is like swimming downstream. When that support is missing, you're just bucking the current. For several years, my colleagues and I taught an excellent comprehensive reading curriculum with the support of principals and district administration. The curriculum implementation produced dramatic effects among kindergartners and first graders in the district's lowest performing elementary school, Center City. This school was on its way, but it could take some time for the results to manifest themselves in the state tests, which were administered in third grade and later, and thereby gain adequate learning progress status under the No Child Left Behind law. Then the current changed. Our superintendent retired, and shortly thereafter we lost our assistant superintendent in charge of curriculum and our literacy coordinator. The new superintendent mandated that Center City replace our successful reading program with the Basel program. Some teachers scrambled to find time to supplement the Basel program with instruction they knew worked, but it was difficult, and progress slowed among the primary grade students. However, those early gains in reading finally showed up in the spring state tests, and Center City made AYP. In the spring of the next year, Center City became eligible to apply for a federal reading grant. The district and a new principal, without consulting the school's reading specialists or classroom teachers, decided to apply, assigning the grant writing job to an employee of the Basel publisher. Despite their strenuous efforts, the faculty ended up with minimal input. The application was accepted and a reading coach hired. Although enjoying the principal's support, the coach made decisions that negatively affected student instruction and alienated the teachers. The following spring, after 3 years of inadequate reading instruction, Center City failed to make AYP. What are the lessons to be learned from this experience? First, when new players enter the game, they want to make their own impact and will initiate changes that may not be as effective as the administrator already has in place. Second, the people closest to the action may not be consulted in decisions that greatly affect them. And third, although in our work as teachers, the students should present our primary challenge, this isn't always the case. Still, we can never stop bucking the current on their behalf. In this chapter, we do not intend to examine in detail the authority of power that enable various groups to influence certain aspects of public education. However, even a brief look at the interplay of influence exercised by professional education, organization, parents, business, and the courts and the federal government yields some fascinating insights into how decisions about public education are actually made. Among the most influential forces on the schools are professional education organizations, in particular the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. In recent years, the role of teacher organizations in determining educational policy has greatly increased. At the national level, the NEA and the AFT exert considerable influence on educational policy and legislation. Moreover, the state affiliates of both associations are among the most effective lobbying groups in their respective states. State politicians pay attention to these organizations because of their power and influence. The NEA and the AFT affiliates have well-articulated positions on selected issues, represent hundreds of thousands of teachers who can be mobilized to vote for or against particular legislators, and spend considerable amounts of money to make their positions known. At the local level, largely as a result of collective bargaining techniques, including work stoppages and the threat of them, teacher organizations have won more and more power over educational policy. Today, many local teacher organizations, including NEA and AFT affiliates, have won recognition as the official bargaining representatives of their members. Such organizations are also demanding that issues previously considered the prerogatives of local school boards and superintendents be subject to collective bargaining. Among these areas of contention are teacher and paraprofessional salaries, clerical and secretarial assistants, curriculum development, fringe benefits, in-service training, class size, textbook selection, and even the appointment of department heads and other school administrators. However, in some states, conservative legislators and governors have implemented policies that were strongly opposed by teacher organizations. In both Florida and North Carolina, for example, teacher tenure was abolished, and in North Carolina, teacher salary increases for earning master's degrees were done away with. As a result, the influence of teacher organizations seems to be waning in some states. Ask educators who has the most influence in determining whether children succeed in school, and almost all of them will have the same response: parents. Parents are their children's first and primary teachers, and the only ones who follow a child's progress from year to year. As the two major forces for educating and socializing children in society, parents and teachers should be natural allies. Too often, however, a wide chasm separates them. Some teachers fear that parents will interfere with their classrooms. Others feel pressured for time and don't want to spend the extra effort to communicate with and effectively involve parents. Some parents seem too consumed with the problems of work and raising a family to become involved in schools, whereas others actively participate in various school functions. Research is clear on this point. Without effective parental interest and involvement in the schools, most students will not succeed academically. In a national survey of public school teachers, 73% of teachers found engaging parents and the community and improving the education of students to be either challenging or very challenging. The Parent-Teacher Association is a loosely knit national organization with over 5 million members and more than 26,000 local units. The local parent-teacher group, sometimes called the PTO, may or may not be affiliated with the national PTA. Local groups devise their own organizations and activities to fit the needs of the local school community. Generally, they serve as a communications link between parents and the formal school organization, with teachers usually acting as representatives of the schools. Most PTOs are comparatively impotent in achieving educational aims. This weakness of parent groups concerns educational reformers because they know that reforms will last only if parents become actively involved in the schoolwork of their schools. Some states have actually passed legislation mandating that schools involve parents in school governance and in the education of the students. Many strategies can be implemented to increase parental involvement and improve the partnership between parents and teachers. Frequent parent-teacher conferences, homework hotlines, websites, or emails through which parents can find out about homework assignments or communicate with teachers, workshop for parents that address a variety of topics, school volunteer programs, and school councils on which parents, teachers, and administrators discuss schools' policies and practices. Teacher and school administrators must be trained to overcome barriers to effective parental involvement and to create school environments where parents of all races, ethnicities, and social classes feel welcome. Throughout American history, concern about the quality of U.S. public education and its ability to produce workers with the knowledge and skills that business needs has prompted partnerships between educators and business executives. In particular, during the 80s and 90s and continuing into the 21st century, the business community has been at the forefront of efforts to restructure public education. Business leaders have been substantially involved in almost every educational reform report. As a result, they have become both the strongest critics and the staunchest advocates for public education. More than 100,000 business school partnerships have been formed since 1983, and business has donated hundreds of millions of dollars to improve elementary and secondary schools. Why should the business community show such an interest in the field of education? Its initiatives to improve the quality of American education go beyond altruistic impulses. One source estimates that children between the ages of 4 and 19 spend almost $200 billion per year, and children and teens influence the spending of up to $670 billion each year. With that kind of money involved, businesses would certainly like to make their presence known in the schools where these potential consumers are a captive audience. In addition, like the nation's governors, many business leaders are convinced that educational reform is essential to the health of the U.S. economy. Competition from Asian and European manufacturers in world markets, a massive U.S. trade deficit, and industry's perception that entry-level workers lack proper job skills has focused attention on educating the American workforce. In fact, U.S. companies spend billions of dollars annually on remedial education for their workers. A recent coalition of businesses and educational organizations and government leaders, the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, seeks to make changes in our nation's schools by aligning classroom environments with what the organization believes are real-world environments. This alignment occurs by fusing the course subjects and 4 C's. The course subjects include English, reading or language arts, mathematics, science, foreign languages, civics, governments, economics, arts, history, and geography. The 4 C's include critical thinking and problem solving, communication, collaboration, and creativity and innovation. The P21 Innovation has developed a framework outlining the knowledge and skills that students will need, and educators and business leaders are working hard to implement these outcomes in our schools. Not everyone sees the greater business involvement in education as a totally positive trend. Some experts concerned that financial support from business will lead to business intrusion, that schools may be unduly shaped to meet business needs. Another concern centers on business provision of free curriculum and instruction materials for teachers. Critics argue that corporate handouts are not simply supplementary gifts, but rather sophisticated marketing tools containing subtle and not so subtle messages to support the corporation biases and promote brand identification and product loyalty. For example, Clairol distributes free bags of shampoo to students as they leave school, along with surveys asking whether they had a good or bad hair day. In another example, a Nike program asks young people to devote a week of classroom time to learning the life cycle of a Nike shoe. Other opponents of corporate involvement in the schools subject to exclusive marketing to sell only projects produced by the particular company in exchange for funding from the firm. Some people cynically view businesses' push for the expanded use of technology in schools as an attempt to sell new products. Another way business influences education is through the recent movement towards private management of public schools, known as educational management organizations, that has occurred in some urban areas. Private corporations such as the Edison Learning, KIPP, and Sylvan Learning, Inc. have contracted with some school districts to provide specific educational services, operate schools whose students have been performing poorly on academic tests, or begin new schools with promising designs. K-12 Inc. partners with public and private schools to offer online learning for elementary and secondary students. Advocates of this privatization movement argue that private corporations can operate these schools more effectively and less expensively than can public entities. Opponents of this trend, especially teachers' unions, claim that schools operate under a profit motive may shortchange students' welfare, and the private firms drive to make money. They do so, the critics claim, by hiring inexperienced teachers, using unlicensed staff, and eliminating high-cost special education programs. To date, private management of public schools has often led to cleaner buildings, greater access to computers, and more individualized instruction, but the verdict is still out on whether they lead to academic improvement. There is no question that the role of business community in educational affairs has greatly expanded since the mid-'80s, and most people see this trend as a positive one. Businesses and corporations, which have a vested stake in the outcomes of public education, will undoubtedly continue to be major players in the reform of our educational system. The challenge for educators will be to walk the fine line between partnerships and cooperation on the one hand and exploitation for commercial purposes on the other. Although the federal government does not have formal authority over education, all 3 branches of the government exercise considerable influence over schools in the country through legislation, court rulings, and the activities of the U.S. Department of Education. The history of education has been shaped by important court decisions on the duties and responsibilities of school officials in such areas as school desegregation, religion in the schools, student rights, and especially at the state level, school finance. The U.S. Supreme Court has played a particularly important role in changing educational policy in this country, because its rulings have altered or reduced the power of state and local educational authorities. Some of the court's decisions have generated deep reinstatement among those who arbor this federal intrusion into states' rights. Other people applaud the court's decisions as steps intended to make American education more responsive to broad democratic principles. Over the years, the Supreme Court has issued key rulings affecting such important educational policies as desegregation, public aid to private schools, rights of people with disabilities, gender equality, voucher plans, and sexual harassment. Even as powerful as they are, the courts cannot do everything by themselves. Often, judicial rulings must be supported by federal administrative and legislative action before they can alter educational practice. In the famous 1954 case of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, for example, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the doctrine of separate but equal had no place in public education. But how was this monumentous judgment to be implemented? The court declared that all deliberate speed should be employed to abolish the dual school system for African Americans and whites. but no judicial guidelines were developed to steer this process. As a result, almost no changes occurred for a decade until a combination of new congressional laws on civil rights and education, along with strong enforcement of desegregation by President Lyndon Johnson's administration, took place in the 60s. The Department of Education is a significant part of the federal government with cabinet-level status and a budget of slightly more than $71 billion in fiscal year 2013. The department's administrators a variety of programs passed by Congress, including programs concerned with elementary and secondary education, post-secondary education, educational research and development, vocational and adult education, special education, and civil rights. It also administers funds devoted to the collection of educational statistics. In addition, billions of additional federal dollars for education are administered by other federal agencies, such as the Department of Health and Human Services, the National Science Foundation, and the Department of Defense. The federal government's level of involvement in education often fluctuates depending on whether Republicans or Democrats control the White House and Congress, and on the particular ideology professed by the party in power. Republicans generally have sought to decrease the involvement of the federal government in education, even advocating abolition of the U.S. Department of Education, whereas Democrats tend to be more supportive of both the department and federal efforts to improve education. Bucking this trend during the administration of President George W. Bush, the federal government's share of costs for elementary and secondary education increased from 7% to slightly less than 9% by 2007. By 2014, the economic stimulus money, along with the regular education funding, had brought the federal share to over 10%. The total amount of money available to a school district for education is the sum of locally raised revenues, state aid, federal aid, and the miscellaneous revenues. During much of the country's history, most of the money used to support public elementary and secondary schools came from local revenue sources, primarily property taxes. Beginning in the late 70s, for the first time in U.S. history, the state's share of support for public education exceeded the local share, and this situation continues today. Increased state revenues have helped offset the decrease in local funding of the schools. Currently, state governments contribute about 46%, local governments provide approximately 43%, and the federal government provides over 10% of financing of public schools. The percentages of educational expenditures funded by federal, state, and local sources vary considerably from state to state. Federal contributions for public education range from a high of 19% of educational spending for Mississippi to a low of about 3% for New Jersey. Local contributions range from a high of 66% of educational spending for Illinois to a low of 2% for Hawaii. The states receiving the highest proportion of revenues from state sources are Vermont and Hawaii, at almost 88%. The state with the lowest level of state funding is Illinois at 20% of educational spending. Let's look in more detail at state and local spending and funding patterns. Figure 11.2 shows the upward trend in average expenditure per pupil and enrollment. The nationwide average stood at $11,373 per pupil for the 2013 and 2014. From state to state, however, the per pupil expenditures vary widely, ranging from a high of over $21,000 per pupil each year to a low of just over $7,000. The reason for these differences is primarily economic. A state's ability to pay for education depends on the income level of its residents and corporations and the willingness of its citizens to financially support public education. In general, the southwestern states fund education at lower levels than do the northeastern states, but the cost of living in the southwest is generally less than the cost of living in the northeast. As a result of the lower funding, our students who live in some of the Sun Belt states being deprived of a quality education, the connection between funding and excellence of education is often disputed. But a thorough review of the research on this issue concluded that higher per pupil expenditures, better teacher salaries, more educated and experienced teachers, and smaller class and school sizes, all directly a result of higher funding, are strongly related to improved student learning. Conversely, some researchers assert that no such relationship exists between the amount of money spent on education and the achievements of the students in that school district. State governments use a combination of sales, personal income, corporate income, and excise taxes to generate revenues. Some states fund their schools partly with income from state-run lotteries. State revenue systems are a are as diverse as school finance plans and reflect the socioeconomic makeup, the political climate, and the educational needs for each state. Local governments, in contrast, rely primarily on property taxes for income. Most states require the citizens in the school district to vote either on their property tax rate to support education or on the school budget itself. Many states have begun to rely less on local property taxes to fund their schools. Why would districts want to minimize their reliance on property taxes? Many knowledgeable educators and politicians argue that one of the major causes of unequal educational opportunities in this country is the method used to finance school systems. Because local school districts rely heavily on property taxes, those districts where property values are high generate much more money to finance their schools than those districts where property values are low. Within the same state, for example, the average amount of money spent per child in one district may be more than 3 times the amount spent in a nearby district. Such spending differentials result in great educational disparities, as measured by pupil-teacher ratios, training and experience of staff, and availability of facilities, equipment, and counseling services. Many politicians arguing against the need for increased spending on education assert that the United States already spends more on public education than do most comparable countries, but gets worse results. Money is not the answer, they claim. We can shed some light on the debate by comparing U.S. educational spending with that of some other countries. To allow for differences in size of the economies, we can consider public spending on education as a percentage of gross domestic product, the total value of a country's output. The United States spends 3.7% of its GDP on public elementary and secondary education, and the average for the 34 industrialized countries sampled was also 3.7%. Countries that spend more than the United States include Norway, United Kingdom, Iceland, Denmark, Ireland, and Belgium. Countries spending the same percentage as the United States include the Netherlands and Australia. Countries spending less than the United States include Slovak Republic, Japan, Czech Republic, and Spain. Such figures indicate that the U.S. devotes a similar percentage of its resources to public elementary and secondary education as the average of other industrialized nations. However, the U.S. might be expected to spend proportionally more than other countries because of certain characteristics of its school system and society. The decentralized school system in the U.S. is more expensive than the single, centrally administered system found in many other industrialized nations. The U.S. population is more diverse than most countries, which presents unique educational challenges, and the very high number of U.S. children living in poverty creates additional demands for schools. Also, the United States, compared with the other countries, spends a much greater percentage of its public education funds on special education services. Given these factors, and compared to other industrialized nations, the percentage of U.S. GDP spent on elementary and secondary education does not seem extravagant. As a result of numerous court decisions, efforts to equalize the disparities in funding within states have shifted some of the responsibility for funding from local school districts to the state level. A 1971 class action suit, Serrano v. Priest, charged that California schools financing scheme was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court of California supported the parents' claim that the quality of a child's education must not be a function of wealth other than the wealth of the state as a whole. The court also held that the California system of financing schools on the basis of local property taxes violated the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which provides equal protection of the law for all citizens. In 1973, however, the Supreme Court of the United States, by a 5-4 vote, reversed a similar decision involving the school finance system of the state of Texas. The court found that the U.S. Constitution was not violated because the right to an education is not guaranteed explicitly or implicitly by the Constitution. Although federal law had not been violated, the court did indicate that the funding should not be interpreted as a victory for the status quo. In effect, issues of inequity in school finance were returned to the province of the state courts and legislators. Many state constitutions, unlike the U.S. Constitution, contain equal protection clauses that can be interpreted to include education as a protected right. Since the Rodriguez case, other state courts have ruled that their school financing systems violate their state constitutions. In those states where the finance system has been ruled unconstitutional, the issue has centered on inadequacies in the level of educational opportunities offered to children in the poorer school districts. The courts in those states considered whether the poor children were receiving a sufficient education as required by the state constitution and as measured by contemporary educational standards, or by comparisons with the best or highest spending districts. In contrast, in states where the system of school finance was upheld, the courts usually interpreted their state constitutions as guaranteeing only a basic minimum level of funding. As a result of court challenges, more than 20 states have reformed their school finance laws since 1973, and some states continue to grapple with the issue. In the last few years, state courts seem to be backing away from making decisions about increasing K-12 funding, stating that education funding is a political question for the legislature, not the courts to decide. Educators, parents, and public officials are greatly concerned that the quality of a child's education should not depend on whether the child lives in a school district with high property values. Many of these concerned citizens are urging that the state governments take responsibility for raising educational revenue and distributing all funding for local schools to the school districts. The school districts would continue to be in charge of the operation of the local schools, but would no longer carry the burden of raising the money needed to do so. As the popularity of charter schools has grown, some parents and members of the public have expressed concern regarding charter schools draining money from regular public schools. This issue will continue to be examined in years to come. For more on charter schools, see Chapter 12, How Should Education Be Reformed? Although the federal government typically provides much less money for public schools than do state or local governments, federal funds are strategically important and have a far greater impact than their proportion of school funding would suggest. Much of the federal aid to education traditionally has taken the form of categorical grants. That is, money that must be spent for designated purposes, stated generally in the legislation and more precisely by the federal agency administrating the funds. As a result, the federal government has been able to influence school districts and institutions that have accepted or sought its aid. For example, in an effort to stimulate the U.S. economy out of recession, the U.S. Congress passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. This piece of legislation provided $787 billion in tax cuts and benefits, funds for education, healthcare, and jobless benefits, and federal contracts, grants, and loans. In 2010, Congress also passed legislation to provide an additional $20 billion in an education jobs fund to help school districts to keep from laying off thousands of teachers. Although much of the ARRA money and earmarked for education went directly to the states for their cash-strapped education programs, the U.S. Department of Education kept $4.35 billion for its Race to the Top competition. The Race to the Top competition was designed to encourage and reward states for education innovation and reform. States that wished to compete for Race to the Top funds had to submit proposals that showed they would accomplish the following: turn around their lowest achieving schools, recruit, develop, reward, and retain effective teachers and principals, build data systems that measure student growth and success, and inform teachers and principals to improve instruction, adopt standards and assessments that prepare students to succeed in college and the workplace and to compete in the global economy. Although many states were appreciative of the opportunity to compete for these funds, other states elected not to submit proposals because they resisted the direction that the competition criteria would lead them. Some states also feared that they would have to pick up the finances after federal funding ran out. Although the federal government provides money for a variety of educational programs, its most significant efforts have sought to address the needs of children from high poverty areas who are at risk for educational failure. Compensatory education is an approach to create more equal educational opportunities for disadvantaged children. Compensatory education was formalized in a section of the original Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965, known as Title I. Congress continues to strongly support Title I, improving the academic achievement of the disadvantaged because the money reaches almost every school district and thus provides jobs and services in every congressional district. Few members of Congress will vote against providing these benefits to their districts. Under the 2001 reauthorization of ESEA, called the No Child Left Behind Act, Title I has come to account for the largest portion of federal spending on public schools. Title I was designed to do two things: deliver federal funds to local school districts and schools for the education of students from low-income families, and supplement the educational services provided to low-achieving students in those districts. Subsequent reauthorizations of ESEA have changed the rules for schools that receive Title I funds. To receive money, states and school districts now must submit a state improvement plan that includes the adoption of challenging content standards and aligned assessments for Title I students. Schools are allowed to use their Title I funds on a school-wide basis rather than only for the poorest students, and they can combine money from multiple federal programs. At the same time, school districts must rank their schools based on their percentage of poor students and distribute Title I funds accordingly, with the poorest schools receiving the most money per pupil. Between 1965 and 2013, Title I provided almost $300 billion in educational services in almost all of the nation's school districts. In fiscal year 2012, this program distributed more than $14.5 billion on behalf of more than 17 million children in more than 50,000 schools. However, in 2013, Congress allowed sequestration to occur, reducing the budget for Title I by $725 million and affecting more than 1.2 million disadvantaged students. Compensatory programs come in many forms. Some are preventative approaches targeting children who are at risk for later school failure during their preschool or infant years. Such programs may help parents learn how to interact more effectively with their babies and young children in the areas of cognitive and psychosocial development. The most famous preschool initiative is Head Start. Head Start is a federal program that aims to improve the learning skills, social skills, and health status of preschool-age poor children so that they can begin schooling on an equal basis with their more advantaged peers. Since its inception in 1965, Head Start has served more than 30 million children in total, and it currently supports almost 1 million children. Although Head Start is almost 50 years old, the program is not without its critics. Unlike other sectors of public education, it is the target of reform. For the 2011 fiscal year, the federal government budgeted $8.2 billion for Head Start programs. Along with Congress's reauthorization of the Head Start program, however, came a call for a new focus on academics. The proposed focus on academics has been strongly opposed by many early childhood education experts who fear that the increased attention to academic skills will dilute efforts to promote positive social and emotional development, and that the health services Head Start currently provides will be abandoned. Others argue that there is no reason why Head Start programs cannot address all these goals satisfactorily. Certainly, the students served by Head Start programs need and deserve attention to academic, social, and health concerns so that they will be prepared to succeed in school. Some compensatory programs are designed to intervene with even younger children, from birth to age 3, for example. Some programs target children with developmental delays, whereas other target older children and focus on basic skill instruction, tutoring, or remediation in a variety of academic areas. Success for All, described in the up-close box on page 361, is an example of a program that is implemented in elementary schools. Dropout prevention programs, job training, and adult literacy instruction are all attempts to help older individuals improve the quality of their lives through education and to help prevent the cycle of educational disadvantage from being passed down through generations. Evaluations of Title I and other compensatory education programs, such as Head Start, have yielded mixed results. A recent evaluation of Head Start showed modest gains for children in this program in terms of their pre-reading, pre-writing, and vocabulary skills, but no improvements were found in oral comprehension or math skills. One researcher states that although children in Head Start make learning gains, they are well behind middle-class kids when they start the program, and that making modest improvements doesn't close the gap in a major way. By contrast, long-range studies have followed students from preschool to age 19, like the study of students in the very successful Perry preschool program in Michigan, provide other indicators of program success. Effective early childhood programs may result in fewer special education placements, more high school graduations, and lower teen pregnancy rates, increased employment and earnings, fewer crimes committed, and greater commitment to marriage. Early intervention, beginning the program early in the child's life, may provide the key to success in its compensatory education programs. Critics of Title I see little point in strengthening programs that they believe have failed to meet their original goals. Proponents of Title I argue that, considering the enormity of the problem, the expenditures devoted to such programs are a mere drop in the bucket. In spite of what seems like an enormous amount of money, only about 50% of all eligible children receive services from Title I. One compensatory education program that has proved quite successful is the Success for All program developed by the Center for Research on Effective Schooling for Disadvantaged Students at Johns Hopkins University. The Success for All program restructures the elementary school with one goal in mind: to ensure that all students perform at grade level in reading, writing, and math by the end of third grade. Success for all schools start early, offering a half day of preschool and a full day of kindergarten, both focused on providing a developmentally appropriate learning experience for children. The curriculum emphasizes the development and use of language and balances academic readiness with music, art, and movement activities. The program also makes use of the center's research findings to implement one-to-one tutoring, regrouping for reading, family support teams, frequent assessments of learning with immediate help on problems, and an effective reading program. 2 social workers and 1 parent liaison work full-time in the schools to provide parenting education and to encourage parents to support their children's efforts. The program also includes tutors for children in grades K through 3. Each tutor is a certified experienced teacher or a paraprofessional who works one-on-one with 11 students per day. First graders get priority for tutoring. The Success for All program includes 90 minutes of uninterrupted reading instruction each day, during which teachers are asked to follow a fast-paced script written by the Success for All researchers. In spite of its success in teaching students to read, many teachers dislike the reading program because it tells them exactly what to do throughout their lessons. For some teachers, this process seems contrary to their beliefs about the importance of paying attention to the learning style of each child and varying their instruction accordingly. Overall, evaluation results for students enrolled in Success for All have been outstanding, much higher than for any other investigation strategy ever tried with at-risk students. Starting with one Baltimore school in 1987, the Success for All program had spread to approximately 1,500 schools in 48 states, and it has produced dramatic gains in students' reading proficiency. Almost all Success for All programs are in high-poverty Title I schools, and the costs of implementing the program are about the same as the costs for supporting students in other Title I schools. The primary lesson learned, according to the major developer of Success for All, Robert Slavin, and his colleagues, is that disadvantaged children can routinely achieve substantially greater success in schools that are neither exceptional nor extraordinary, rather than having to depend on the availability of an outstanding principal or charismatic teacher to ensure success. Every child, regardless of background, has an excellent opportunity to succeed in school. In 2010, Success for All received a $49 million grant from the U.S. Department of Education, investing in innovation competition, which is aimed at improving achievement for students at risk of academic failure. Because Title I has never been funded at a high enough level to meet the needs of low-income schools, and because its resources are widely dispersed, even the recent funding increases have not checked the growing educational crisis in low-income areas. Proponents can also point to recent gains in achievement. A 2007 national assessment of Title I showed that students whom Title I is intended to benefit have made modest gains in meeting proficiency levels on state assessments in reading and math, as well as on the National Assessment of Educational Process tests in reading and math. Although the performance of students in high-poverty schools is improving, they continue to lag behind their higher-income peers in meeting basic standards of performance in both reading and math. As the centerpiece of the NCLB law, Title I will likely continue to receive funding increases in the years to come. Both sides acknowledge that not all programs are equally effective. The best programs achieve desired results, whereas the less effective programs do not seem to have lasting effects on student performance. Likewise, both sides can argue that in addition to education efforts, a simultaneous attack should be made on external factors that contribute to low achievement, such as poor housing, family instability, health and nutrition, and low income. End of chapter 11.